Getting started with Zapier is easy, but building scalable and flexible automations for you and your team can take a little more work. Today, I want to share 5 of the key automation concepts that will help beginners to understand how Zapier really works. I'm going to talk about test data, variables, default values, paths, and run history. These aspects of Zapier are essential for building and maintaining Zaps that support real companies in practical use cases. Hi, I'm Tom from XRay.tech, the workflow company. At XRay, we're a global leader in enterprise implementations for Zapier and Airtable, among other no-code tools. And on this channel, we like to share our experience to help everyone create more time in their day. To see more workflow automation tips and tutorials every single week, like this video and subscribe to our channel. Be sure to turn on those notifications too. In this video, we'll take a look at 5 concepts and techniques that will help you take your Zaps to the next level. I'll explain how they all work, and I'll demonstrate some practical examples that you can build yourself to try them out. Understanding these concepts and tools will help you leverage Zapier as a time-saving resource for an entire team, not just for an individual user. There's a lot to cover here, so let's get started. First, let's start by taking a look at test data. Test data is a concept that we've touched on in our Zapier Beginner's Guide, as well as many other Zapier tutorials on our channel. But it's worth taking a look at to explain test data in detail. Test data is an essential part of any automation, and you cannot build a Zap without test data. For instance, if you want to build a Zap that runs whenever a new event is added to a specific Google Calendar, you need to have an event on the calendar that you want to use as test data before you start building the Zap. Any data in your trigger app can be used as test data, but you usually should pick something that has all the information you intend to use in your automation. For instance, if you want to reference the Zoom link from the calendar event in your Zap, you should use an event with a Zoom link as your test data. Let's see what a good test looks like and what a bad test looks like. Here's the automation we want to build. Whenever a new event is added to the calendar, send a Slack alert in the tutorials channel. The Slack message will list the event title, attendees, the start time and date, the description, and the Zoom link for the meeting. First, we'll create some good test data. I'll make a Google Calendar event called Test Event. Giving it a name like that will make it easy to identify it later in Zapier. I'll add an attendee, and I'll add a Zoom link for conferencing. Then I'll provide a brief description. This event has all the data we want to reference in our Slack message later, so we can start building our automation now. First, I'll make a trigger and choose Google Calendar as the app. The triggering event will be New Event in Google Calendar. Then I'll choose my Google account. And I'll pick the calendar that I want Zapier to watch. Now, Zapier will prompt us to test the trigger. While you can skip testing on any actions you add to your Zap if you really want to, you can't skip testing the trigger. You need to test your trigger before you can turn on and publish your automation. So we'll run the test. Zapier will retrieve the 3 most recent pieces of data that match the triggering conditions. If your test data doesn't show up here, you can click on Load More to see more data. Sometimes it just takes a minute to pop into Zapier. Keep in mind, if you're expecting test data and don't see it, it's likely something is configured incorrectly in your trigger. You might be watching the wrong folder or the wrong calendar, for instance. But I can see Test Event right here, so I'll select that. You can see that Zapier retrieved a ton of information associated with this calendar event. That's going to be useful as we start building our Slack message. So we know that Zapier can find the data it needs to start running the automation. Now, we want to build and test the action that we want Zapier to perform whenever a new calendar event is created. I'll add a step to this Zap. I'll choose Slack as the app and send channel message as the event. Then I'll pick my Slack account. Now I can compose the message and include some of the data that we retrieved in the trigger. A new event has been added to your calendar. And I'll add the title, or summary as it's called here, the description, the start date and time, the list of attendees, and the Zoom link. Sometimes, though, the data you retrieve in Zapier won't be labeled very clearly. For instance, the link for the Zoom call in a Google Calendar event is called Conference Data Entry Points Label. In some cases, Google Calendar will copy the Zoom link to the location field as well, but that depends on your user's Zoom or calendar settings. This is one of the reasons why test data can be so useful. Inside of the results, you have this search bar, which you can use to find specific data points. So when I search for Zoom, the results show me the URL that include the term Zoom, which is how I found out that it's associated with the variable called Conference Data Entry Points Label. So I'll add that data to my Slack message along with the other information, and finish configuring this step with a few other settings. Now I'll test this step. Testing actions in Zapier is optional, but I would always recommend testing every single step while you're building. Note that testing an action in Zapier will actually run that action in your software, so testing a Slack message step will actually send a Slack message. When you're creating test data, you'll want to make sure to use appropriate channels, email addresses, and accounts. You don't want to bug clients or colleagues with test messages while you're building. With all that in mind, I'll run this test and send a Slack message to our tutorial Slack channel. When I check Slack, I see the message right here. There's a lot of useful information, including that Zoom link. When I click on it, I'm taken to the Zoom meeting. Our test is complete, and we know how our automation works when it comes with all the data. But what if our test data didn't have all this information? Let's take a look at bad or incomplete test data. I'll quickly make a new calendar event called Test Event, no Zoom, no description, and I won't include a Zoom link. I also won't include a description. Now, I'll go back to Zapier. If you want to test a Zap with new data, you always need to go back to the trigger. So I'll retest the trigger and load more data. Now I can see the new no Zoom, no description event. I'll choose that and start creating a Slack action like I did before. But this time, I can't find the Zoom link. When I search for Zoom or Conference Data Entry Points Label, the variable that we saw in our earlier test data isn't there at all. Because our Google Calendar test data is incomplete, there's no way to add a Zoom link to our Slack alert. On the other hand, you'll note that the description variable is still available, even though it's empty. With incomplete test data, you'll encounter both of these scenarios. Some variables will be missing entirely, and others will just be blank. This means you won't be able to add the missing variables as you're configuring additional action steps. And while you can add the blank variables to your action steps, you won't be able to confirm their contents or formatting when you run a test since there's no data there. I'll test this Slack message now. And we can see there's no Zoom link and no description. With incomplete test data, we can't build the automation that we want, a Slack message including a Zoom link, or confirm that it's working as intended. That's why your test data should have every bit of information that you intend to include in your ideal automation. If anything, you should err on the side of using more data than you think you need. As you've been watching our examples or you've been using Zapier, you may have noticed that the data retrieved in Zapier always follows a similar format. Both events we tested had labels for nearly all of the same information. They both had these labels for summary, attendees, start date, and description, but the specific data associated with these labels differed for each event. These are what we call variables. In Zapier, a variable refers to each piece of information retrieved from any step in your automation. A variable can be something like a calendar event's name or its start time. If you're automating a CRM like HubSpot, you'll see variables for each contact's name, their deal status, and dozens of other attributes unique to each contact. If you're automating your e-commerce store in Shopify or Magento, you'll see variables relating to product prices, variants, and descriptions. Regardless of the app involved, variables describe all of the available attributes for whatever digital object Zapier is processing. Every calendar event will always include a similar set of variables in Zapier, and every HubSpot contact will include the same list of variables as every other contact. The variables are always the same, but the values, the actual data associated with each variable, can change every time. That's why they're called variables and why we build automations. That ability to include dynamic data is one of the things that makes Zapier so useful. In our simple automation with Slack alerts for calendar events, the alert is only really helpful if it includes the right details and Zoom link for each unique event. In other contexts, using variables can help you to accommodate an entire team with a single automation instead of building a unique Zap for each person. Instead of sending an email to a single fixed address, you could send an email to a dynamically retrieved address that will reflect the data that triggered the Zap to run. Now, with test data, we can always control what information we include and what information we leave out. But when your Zaps are live and taking in data from the real world, inconsistencies are inevitable. We can design and build an automation that assumes people will always provide a description and a Zoom link, but we know that sometimes people might forget to add them to their events. And when they do, what happens to the automation? Thankfully, Zapier provides some simple ways to respond to different data with different actions. All you have to do is add default values or paths to your automation. We'll start with default values. Default values can be used to provide a fallback value for an empty variable. For instance, if the calendar event is missing a description, we can add a default value to use the text "no description provided" instead of just having a blank space. To get started, add a new action and choose Formatter. Formatter is a Zapier tool that allows you to reformat text, numbers, lists, and more. Your formatter step must be placed after the trigger and before any action where you want to include the default value. So in our case, it needs to go before the Slack message. For the event, choose text and select default value as the action. Then choose the variable that you want to replace if it's empty. In our example, that will be the description. Enter the text that should be used as the default value if the chosen variable is empty or doesn't exist. I'll enter "no description provided." Now I'll give it a test. First, I'll go back to the trigger and select the calendar event without a description. I'll test the formatter step now. And it replaced the blank variable with "no description provided." Perfect. Next, I'll test the step again with an event that does have a description. And this time, it leaves the text as is. Whenever you're working with default values or paths, you'll want to test each possible outcome that you've added to the Zap. If you'd like to add multiple default values, just add a new formatter step for each one. I'll quickly add another formatter step to set a default value if the Zoom link is missing as well. This formatter can go anywhere after the trigger and before the Slack message. I'll also rename both formatter steps so that I know which one corresponds to which variable. Now, to use the default values, we'll need to update our Slack message. Instead of using variables from the trigger for the description and Zoom link directly, we'll need to use the variables from each respective formatter step. As we saw in our last test, the formatters won't change anything if the description and Zoom link are provided. So using these variables will work no matter what the input is. Now, with our Slack message updated, let's give it a test. And the Slack message now tells us clearly that no description or Zoom link were provided. To be thorough, we should test this automation with each possible configuration. One with a Zoom link and no description, one with a description and no Zoom link, one with both, and one with neither. But I won't waste your time showing you all of those tests. Just remember to test every configuration that you can when building within reason. Default values are great for replacing text, but what if you want your automation to actually perform different actions based on different inputs? To do that, we'll need to use paths. Adding paths will give your automation multiple potential outcomes. Each path will include an associated condition. If the data your Zap is processing meets that condition, it will run down that path. Let's see how paths look in action. I'll add a couple of paths to my calendar alerts Zap. One for events that don't include a Zoom link, and one for events that do. This time, instead of just having a warning that no Zoom link is provided, we want to email the organizer of the event and ask them to add a Zoom link. First, we need to add a new action. I'll add that after the trigger. Then I'll search for paths. Unfortunately, a path has to be the last step in a Zap. That means I'll need to delete this Slack step to add the path before it. Now, I'll go back to adding an action and choose Paths. Instantly, we can see two branching paths added to our Zap. Each path starts with a rule. This is where we'll configure the conditions that make the Zap select the appropriate path. I'll click on the rule under Path A. I want this path to run if the calendar event is missing a Zoom link. So I'll set the condition to conference data entry points label does not exist. Then I'll give it a test. The automation says this action would not have continued down this path since the Zoom link is there. Let's update the test data to an event without a Zoom link. The path now says that it would have continued. Now I can add the action that I want to run in this path. I'll add a Gmail step and configure the email to go to the event organizer, asking politely to add a Zoom link to the event. I'll give the step a test. And since I'm the organizer, I can see the email in my inbox. Back in Zapier, I'll also add the Slack alert to path A, configured exactly as it was before. Next, we can configure path B. The condition here will be conference data entry points label exists. Technically, multiple paths can run at the same time. However, it's usually a good practice to make sure that each path's rules are mutually exclusive so that only one path runs at a time. In our example here, the two paths should never run simultaneously. The link will either exist or it won't. Zapier doesn't support quantum superpositions, so it will either be one or the other. In this path, we'll just add the same Slack message that's in the other path, and we'll give it a test. Everything looks good. Both of our paths worked as intended. Note that you can add up to 5 paths within a single path module. From there, you can also add path modules within paths. Just be careful not to make things more complicated than they need to be. With all of these variables and paths, there are many different ways that your Zap might run, and many different outcomes that they could produce. When something isn't working or not working as expected, you might not always be sure which path ran or which one was supposed to run. That's why it's good to check Zap history whenever your automations aren't working as expected or are hitting frustrating errors. Zapier keeps a log of all of your Zap's history. You can access it by clicking on the clock icon in the Zap editor. You can also find history from your Zapier homepage by clicking on the panel on the left. In your history, you can see every action run by your account. You can filter by date range, the name of the Zap, the apps involved, the folder the Zap is stored in, or the Zap creator. You can also use the search bar to search for keywords across Zap titles and the data that your Zaps processed when they ran. Let's filter by our Paths demo Zap, and we can see a couple of results. Note that you'll only see runs that occur while your Zap is on and published. You won't see tests here. You can click on any of these entries and get more details. We see a list of every action that ran and a clear breakdown of which paths ran and which paths didn't. Reviewing the history will let you see exactly where a Zap encountered an error and will provide an error message explaining what happened. The error messages are often clear and helpful, but can sometimes be a little vague. These errors usually come from the app that you're automating, not Zapier itself. A quick Google search with the error message usually helps. Checking the history tab should always be your first step when a Zap isn't working as expected. Zapier is an excellent automation platform for no-code beginners, but even a user-friendly platform like Zapier has the potential to build sophisticated automations that can handle variable data with different outcomes. Understanding how test data, variables, and paths work will help you build more useful, robust Zaps for your team. And keeping an eye on the history tab will make it easy to find and fix any problems that crop up. I hope these concepts help you build better automations, and if there's any other Zapier topics you'd like us to cover, leave a comment down below. If you've enjoyed this video, prove you're human, like and subscribe for more automation tips every single week. If you'd like to learn more about no-code and low-code automation, follow us on LinkedIn, Twitter, or Facebook, and you can find all of our content on our website at xray.tech. You can check all those links in the resources board down below, and as always, find your focus and stay in flow. Trying to future-proof yourself? Start designing the way your team works with no-code tools, automation, and AI. In XRay's Workflow Designer course, we'll show you how to break down every part of a process to find the best opportunities for automation, and how to integrate those automations into your team's daily work. You'll learn how to create time for your entire team, get more reliable results, and give everyone a newfound clarity and confidence in their work. Just go to this URL to learn more. The entire package includes over 2 hours of premium video content, challenging example projects, and tons of helpful resources. The course costs just $250 and gives you lifetime access to a Slack community of workflow designers building systems in dozens of different industries. Space is limited, so join the free waiting list today to get notified as soon as the course is live later this year. Thanks for watching, and we hope to see you soon in our Workflow Designer course.